Thanks so much for having me and the opportunity to discuss this work. So this is a research project that Yukiko and I have been working on for some time. And it's about Japanese multinationals and how they expand abroad. And we think this is has academic relevance for sure, but I also think it has potential relevance for policymakers, both here in Japan and elsewhere too. So let me start. So this paper is at least partly about what we call follow FDI. And what is follow FDI? Well, it's essentially this phenomenon that we see both in Japan and in other countries, that when one multinational establishes, say, a factory in Mexico, then the suppliers of that firm, they tend to follow and also set up a subsidiary in Mexico. So in a sense, we observe that for some companies, they tend to replicate their supply chain, the supply chain they have in Japan, and replicate that in other countries, such as in Mexico or Thailand or other places. And as I mentioned, there's lots of anecdotal evidence that this happens and that this is important. On the slides here, you see one quote from a research paper a few years ago that mentions Toyota as an example of this. So Toyota went to Thailand in the 90s, started to assemble cars there. And according to this, for example, study, they find that Toyota Thailand did not rely on any non-Japanese suppliers to supply critical components for the vehicles that they assembled in Thailand in the late 1990s. So that's a pretty remarkable thing, right? They go to Thailand, they assemble cars there, but they're only using inputs either sourced from Japan or Japanese inputs that are made by suppliers in Thailand. So the question we kind of ask in this paper is, well, can we find causal evidence that when a lead firm is going abroad, that the lead firm then attracts followers, so the car part suppliers, for example, that they also follow the lead firm. Okay, so that's the motivation. Here's another quote I found from the Financial Times last year, which essentially says the same thing, but this is not Thailand, it's Mexico. So here, this article mentions Mazda that started to assemble cars in Mexico. And this also attracted then Japanese car part suppliers, for example, supplying airbags and seatbelts, that they also went to Mexico and established affiliates there. So this one particular news article is about Ashimori then, that supplies these car parts to Mazda, but also other Japanese automakers. Okay, so a final piece of motivation that I think made Yukiko and I very interested in this topic was that, and you'll see this later when we go to the data, but one really important piece of data that we found when we started this project is that when you look at data for Japanese multinationals, you see that 20%, so 1/5 of the sales of Japanese multinationals abroad, they go to other Japanese multinationals also abroad, right? So a big chunk of multinational sales, they do not go to customers in Mexico or customers to the US or whatever. They go to other Japanese multinationals in those foreign markets, right? So 20%, that's a pretty big chunk of multinational sales. And why do we think this piece of information is important? Well, I think there are many implications, both for research and for policy. So from the research angle, I think this is very interesting because it means that the decision to go abroad and become a multinational, that decision is not done in a vacuum. It is done based on what other firms in the supply chain are doing, right? So you cannot look at firms as islands and just look at what they're doing independently. You have to look at what the whole supply chain is doing. And I think this kind of challenges some of the models that we typically use in international trade, where we don't really have this type of mechanism. Also from a research angle, I think this is important because typically when we, like in standard data sets, you would observe like that a firm is selling to the local market. And in the literature, we typically think of this as horizontal FDI. This is what we call horizontal FDI. But I think this kind of, that 20% of the sales is going to other Japanese affiliates kind of challenges that interpretation that local sales is so-called horizontal FDI. This is really something else. From a policy perspective, I also think this is important. So you can think first from the source country's perspective, so Japan's perspective. Well, clearly it means that, you know, whatever policies that we may have to for example, encourage firms to become multinationals, then this would affect not only the firm that becomes a multinational, but potentially also a lot of other firms because they follow the leader to some extent. So that's one policy implication, I think. Another policy implication is from the destination country's point of view. Right? So imagine that Japanese firms go to Thailand. There's a lot of research showing that this has so-called positive spillover effects in the host economy. You could think of, like in Thailand, that Thai workers are employed in Japanese companies. They learn new techniques, they learn management techniques and so forth. So this is a good thing for the host country to attract Japanese multinationals. It's also good for the suppliers if a Thai company becomes a supplier to a Japanese company, or if a Japanese company is selling to a Thai company. This is also creating so-called backward and forward kind of spillovers in the supply chain. Now, this is true as long as, you know, these Japanese companies are selling to local firms, right? If Japanese companies are mainly just trading within themselves, for example in Thailand, then the scope for these possible spillover effects will be much smaller. So we are not looking at that question in this particular research paper, but I think this is there are like interesting things here to explore from a research perspective in the future. Okay, so I talked a lot of the motivation. So, but what do we actually do? So first, I will show you some stylized facts about follow FDI, where we link two main Japanese data sets. One is on Japanese affiliates and what they do abroad, and another data set is on the domestic production network in Japan. So we'll start with that, and then we will go to the question, is there a causal link between a firm establishing an affiliate in, say, Thailand, and suppliers following and also going to Thailand? And we'll do this with a so-called event study approach, which is like a very standard empirical approach to try to tease out these causal effects. The last part of the paper, we try to go a little bit more into the details about the mechanism. Why are they following, and under which condition do we see firms following, and is this kind of consistent with economic theory? Okay, so that's the plan. Yes, I don't want to talk that much about the literature, but I think it's safe to say that from, like, in economics, there is not much work on follow FDI at all. I think perhaps we are the first, or at least one of the first, that really goes into detail into exploring the causal mechanisms of follow FDI. Yes. In the international trade literature, there's lots of papers and research about what determines multinationals' entry into new markets. So that's one of the literatures that we relate to. Another literature is the literature that is linking domestic production networks and multinational activity. And there are some findings out there in the literature, for example, that becoming a supplier to a multinational has lots of positive effects. These suppliers, they increase their sales, they become more productive and so forth, but the follow FDI mechanism have not been explored in this literature so far. Okay. So for the data sets, so I mentioned we're going to use two different data sets here. One is on Japanese multinationals, and another one is on the domestic production network. So the multinationals data is coming from the basic survey on overseas business activities, BSOBA. And this gives us information about each affiliate that the Japanese multinational has abroad, in which country, over a long time period. Now, the crucial thing in this data set that I think is pretty unique to Japan, I haven't seen this for other countries, is that the total sales, say, of a car company that has a subsidiary in, say, Mexico, we see total sales, but we also see how much of that sales is going to Mexico. And within that category, we see how much is going to Mexican firms or Mexican consumers. We see how much is going to other Japanese affiliates located in Mexico. And we see how much of the sales is going to other entities. So that this might be, for example, German affiliates in Mexico. So, and that's the second part there is the bold part that I've kind of emphasized on the slides here. And this is, what's really important here, because then we can really measure follow FDI, how much is going to other Japanese affiliates in these local markets. Okay, yes, and as I mentioned, the second data set is the data set on the domestic production network in Japan. This is coming from Tokyo Shoko Research that has the full firm-to-firm network within the borders of Japan, again over a long time period. And then we can link these two data sets so that we can observe both what's going on in Japan, which firms are supplying which firms, and then we can link this to the multinational activities of these firms. Okay. So I'll start with some basic facts from these two data sets. The first fact is simply that there are very few multinationals in Japan, but many firms are connected to them. Now, this is not a big surprise from the literature. We know that multinationals there are few of them. In our data set, on average, 0.6% of firms are multinational firms. It's a little bit higher than in manufacturing, but still a small number. Now, if you go to the second row here, you see that the share of firms that have multinational customers is more than 20%. And the share of firms that have multinational suppliers is almost 20%. Right? So what does this mean? Well, it means that there are not many multinationals, but they have a huge influence of the economy of Japan because a lot of firms are trading with them, right? And you see this in the last four rows in this table too. In the average firm in Japan has 4 customers and 4 suppliers, but the average multinational in Japan has orders of magnitude more customers and suppliers, 71 and 92 in this table, right? So multinationals, there are few, but they have a lot of connections to other firms within Japan. Okay, the second fact I wanted to mention is that multinational status is correlated in the production network. And what do I mean by this? Well, I simply mean that if I'm a multinational, then my suppliers and my customers, they're also likely to be multinationals. So multinationals tend to trade a lot with each other. We can also see this like in a regression table such as this, where we regress a dummy for whether I'm a multinational, on whether my customer is a multinational, or whether my supplier is a multinational. And these things are again, positively correlated, right? So this doesn't mean that, well, if I'm a supplier, if I'm a multinational, my suppliers and customers become a multinational, but it is suggestive of this mechanism that, you know, that it's consistent with the follow FDI hypothesis, namely that if I become a multinational, my suppliers and customers also become multinationals. Okay, fact 3 is perhaps the most important, and here we go back to this point I mentioned in the beginning, namely that like follow FDI is big. And how big? Well, so one way to measure this is to go back to this data that I mentioned, where we see how much of the sales is going to other Japanese multinationals. And if we do this for all countries and for all firms, we see that 1/3 of local affiliate sales go to other Japanese multinationals. Okay? So again, let's pick an example. Let's take Japanese firms in Mexico. Then we see that 1/3 of their sales go to other Japanese firms also located in Mexico, right? This figure here shows the cross-country variation for this number. So what I want you to focus on here is the blue bars. So that's this share. And from now on, I'll just call this share the follow FDI share, okay? So you see that it varies a lot across countries. I mentioned Thailand in the beginning, in that this, you know, there's anecdotal evidence that this is going on in Thailand, and we also see that here, right? The blue share here is big. It's 60% of sales in Thailand is going to other Japanese affiliates in Thailand. But you see that it's not only Thailand, right? There are many countries where this share is pretty high. It's pretty high in China, in the US, Vietnam stands out here, and so forth. And there are also some countries where it's pretty low. Australia, for example, would be one case where it's less than 10%. Germany, small. Korea, very small. So there's lots of cross-country variation, but in total, it's 1/3. Okay. Yes. The fourth fact I wanted to mention, and this is the final fact, is that follow FDI firms are small at home. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, let's pick an example again. Let's go back to this airbag producer. The Japanese airbag producer is likely not as big as Toyota, right? It's just a car parts producer. And when the car companies are going to Mexico, then we saw this anecdotal evidence that the car, like airbag producer, is also going to Mexico. So what we wanted to do here is to check whether this is, you know, true in the data, that smaller firms tend to follow their big customers abroad. So on the x-axis in this figure, we have the size of all multinational companies in Japan. And on the y-axis, we have this follow FDI share, saying how much of sales is going to all the Japanese affiliates abroad, right? And what we see is that there's a clear downward sloping relationship. So what does this mean? Well, it means that if you're a relatively small firm in Japan, then your follow FDI share is high abroad, right? Exactly as we would predict, that these small car part suppliers, they rely much more on sales to other Japanese affiliates in their foreign markets. Okay, so that was essentially our like the most important facts, I think, which is all like consistent with this hypothesis that we have, that lead firms attract or make the suppliers also become multinationals. And then the next step is to try to provide some causal evidence that this is actually going on. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to do this with a so-called event study approach. And the event study approach is pretty simple. It simply means we're going to look at firms that become a supplier to a Japanese multinational. And then we're going to track that firm over time. And we're going to see whether that firm then also becomes a multinational at some point after it became a supplier to a multinational. So that's the idea. So we're going to have like two groups of firms here. So one group is so-called treatment firms. And these are firms that become a first-time supplier to a multinational during our sample period, which is between 2014 and 2022. And then we have control firms that are firms that never get a customer that is a multinational. Now, we also have firms in our data set that are always selling to multinationals, and they will be omitted from this analysis. And in the table here, you just see kind of the number of firms we have here, the number of firms that are in the treated group, and the number of firms in the control group, and their average size in terms of sales and workers. Okay, so I won't go into too much detail about like the mechanics of this method, but as I said in the beginning, the idea here is to follow the likelihood of a firm becoming a multinational after it becomes a first-time supplier to a Japanese multinational in Japan. Now, there are multiple kind of concerns here that we might be worried about from like an econometric point of view. The main like so-called identifying assumption that we need to do for this to work is that the firms that the firms that are yet to supply multinationals, they form like a credible counterfactual for firms that start supplying to a multinational. And we might question this assumption, and we do lots of like so-called robustness checks to check if this is like a valid assumption. I'll come back to this later. Okay, so let me show you some results. So this is the result of the event study for two groups of firms. The blue is the result for all firms in Japan, and the orange one are results only for manufacturing firms. So what you see here is that the likelihood of becoming a multinational is flat and centered around 0 in the years before you get a multinational customer, right? But then the year you get the multinational customer and the 4 years later, the probability of you becoming a multinational is increasing year by year, right? So this is exactly what we would expect if follow FDI is important. In terms of the magnitudes here, you see that, well, the scales like look very small. For example, for the all firms in Japan, it goes up to 0.2 percentage points. So the likelihood of becoming a multinational is increasing by 0.2 percentage points. That might sound like a very small number, but remember that the share of firms that are multinationals in Japan is only 0.6%. So this means that the likelihood of becoming a multinational is increasing from 0.6% to 0.8%, right? So that's actually a 33% increase in the likelihood of becoming a multinational if you get a customer that is a multinational. So that, I think, is economically it's a pretty high number and meaningful in economic terms. Okay. Let me briefly tell you about, I think, perhaps the main empirical concern that we're facing when we do these kinds of event studies. And I think the main concern is that, well, imagine that, I'm this firm that gets, say, Toyota as a customer. I might get Toyota as a customer because I'm growing and I'm becoming better as a firm, right? Now, if I am growing and I'm becoming better as a firm, I might also become a multinational. And it has nothing to do with Toyota. It has everything to do with me, that I'm just growing and I'm becoming better, right? So these two things might be correlated in time, and it's nothing to do with who my customers are, really. So how can we deal with that kind of problem? Well, what we can do is to look at the patterns, not only in terms of if I become a multinational, but to which locations I go, right? So now we're doing the event study saying, well, I get a customer that has a subsidiary in Vietnam. Am I then also more likely to become a multinational that has a subsidiary in Vietnam, right? So everything now is going to be not only firm specific, but firm country specific. And when we do this, then we can essentially control for this growth type of hypothesis that I had, right? If I'm just growing and I'm becoming better, I might be more likely to become a multinational. But now we can control for that and say, well, am I more likely to become a multinational in Vietnam? So this, I think, is like the strongest type of method we can use to really drill down into this follow FDI mechanism. Okay. Yes, there are some more technical issues that Yukiko and I have been working on with this, and I think I'll drop this for this this presentation, and let me just go quickly to the results. So if you look at this figure, it looks essentially very similar to the first one, right? So again, the blue are all firms in Japan, the orange one are manufacturing firms. Again, we don't see anything in the years before they get a customer that is a multinational, say in Vietnam, and then in the years after, the likelihood is increasing. Again, the results seem to be stronger in manufacturing, but it's also true for other industries as well. So this, I think, gives us confidence that this has, that this supports the follow FDI hypothesis, and this is perhaps the best empirical evidence that we have. Okay. Yes, so let me mention one more empirical concern. We were worried that, well, perhaps this has not so much to do with multinational status, but it's about having big customers. So imagine that getting Toyota as a customer has a lot of benefits. And it's not necessarily the case that it's about the multinational status of Toyota. It's just that when you get big customers, that it in itself is a benefit for the suppliers. So what we did here was to say, well, let's do another event study where the event is no longer getting a multinational customer. The event is I'm getting a big customer. A big customer that is not a multinational, right? And here you see that the event study results are essentially just flat. It's centered around 0 both before and after the event. So this does not support our hypothesis, right? It's not only about size and having big customers that drive this. It's something about multinational status that seems to drive this. Okay. Yeah, in the interest of time, I think I'll skip this and I'll spend the remaining minutes on thinking about economic models and mechanisms. So I think the starting point here is to think about, well, why are firms following? And why do the lead firms care? And I think in order for this to make sense in an economic model, you need two main ingredients. One is that, of course, that geographic proximity somehow matters, right? It's not the same to have a supplier back in Japan when your factory is in Mexico compared to having your supplier like 2 blocks down the road, right? So proximity matters to some extent. The other ingredient you need in the model is that inputs are not perfectly substitutable, right? Of course, there are probably Mexican airbag producers, right? So why wouldn't just Toyota use a Mexican airbag producer when in its factory in Mexico, right? Well, I don't have the, I'm not an expert on cars, but I think it would have to do something about relationships. It's something about the product varieties that, different types of airbags might be better suited for, Japanese cars compared to German cars and so forth. So, but in general, inputs cannot be easily substitutable. Then you wouldn't really follow FDI in the data. In terms of this physical proximity, what do we think this is? Well, a simple interpretation is just like transportation costs, like shipping stuff from Tokyo to Mexico City is costly, right? So that in itself could drive this. But of course, it could be many other things too. It could be having face-to-face interactions with your suppliers and customers. That's valuable. It could be about learning, coordination costs, and other mechanisms. Another thing I think might also be important is about uncertainty. Think about an airbag producer. You know that there's a potential market if you establish a factory in Mexico, but you're uncertain about it, right? There's lots of risk doing that. Well, if you know that you're going to get Toyota as a customer in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, that reduces uncertainty and makes the decision of becoming a multinational much less risky for you. Okay, so those are the ingredients that we need in a simple model. I won't go into too much of the detail and the math here, but this is essentially what we're writing down here, a simple economic model that has these two features. And the first thing we do is to take the perspective of the lead firm. So again, Toyota going to Mexico. How much does the lead firm demand of its inputs if the supplier is 2 blocks down the road, or if the supplier is back in Japan? Then the first thing we can show is that, and this is not, this is very almost trivial, that if your supplier is 2 blocks down the road, you're going to demand more from your supplier, essentially because of all these transportation costs or other types of costs are in that case lower. Now, then we're going to look at the supplier's point of view. what would the supplier do if the lead firm is going to Mexico? Now, then you can look at the profits as the supplier, if it stays at home, stays in Japan, or if it goes to Mexico. So the pie move here is the profits that the supplier would have if it's moving to going to Mexico, and the pie stay is the profits if it's gonna stay in Japan. Then you can show under which conditions the firm is more likely to move to Mexico. And that's the third equation here, where you see this inequality. What does this mean? Well, this essentially says three main things. First, follow FDI is going to be more likely if you have a big customer. So if you have potentially lots of sales to your customer, you're more likely to follow the lead firm. The second thing this says is that if the input share of the customer is high, then you're also more likely to move. So this essentially says, well, if the lead firm is only using Mexican labor, well, then this is not very important. On the other hand, if the lead firm is using lots of parts and components, then your suppliers are more likely to follow. And the third thing this says is that if trade costs are high, or these coordination costs are very high, then you're also more likely to follow. Or if the fixed cost of like setting up shop in Mexico is low, then of course you're also more likely to follow. Yeah, so I have 3 minutes again, and in the remaining few minutes, we're gonna try to test some of these predictions, again going back to the Japanese data. So the first prediction that we saw from this simple model is that, well, if you have a big customer, you're more likely to follow. So what we can do in the Japanese data is to look at the size of the customer, okay? So we're gonna do the event study again, but now we're gonna say, well, what's your likelihood of becoming a multinational if your customer is in the top quartile of the sales distribution? So if you get if a really big customer is, you get a customer that is very big and is a multinational, is then what's the likelihood of you becoming a multinational? So here we can compare the orange line, which is getting a big multinational customer, whereas the blue line, which is just getting a multinational customer. And you see that the orange is higher than the blue, essentially saying that the probability of following is even higher when your customer is big. So this is supporting like the mechanism and our simple model. The second thing we did was to look at this input share hypothesis. Let me remind you, like say if the lead firm is only employing Mexican labor, then the follow FDI will be less strong, right? So what we did here is to go back to the Japanese data and look at the input intensity of different industries in Japan, right? So again, if the input intensity is high, if an industry is using a lot of inputs relative to labor, we would, our model suggests that this follow FDI would be stronger, right? So now we do the event study again, but now the treatment is that you become a first-time supplier to a top quartile input intensity multinational. And here again we see the same pattern, that the orange line is higher than the blue line, suggesting that follow FDI is indeed stronger if input intensity of the customer is high. Okay, I'm out of time, and I think it's time to wrap up. So this is essentially, it's still work in process, but I think already we have a lot of interesting findings here. I think the first one is that, from an academic point of view, I think it's very interesting to think about the fact that we see that production networks domestically has a huge influence on how the domestic production look like abroad. Like from more of a policy point of view, this certainly kind of tells us that the decision to become a multinational, that decision is not done in a vacuum. It depends on what your other firms in your supply chain are doing. And in general, I think this has important implications both for industrial policy and in particular for FDI promotion policies, for example. Thank you.